The terminal hummed with an unsettling hum of recycled air and machinery, the sound of finality. Thousands of lights blinked in sync along the high, sterile walls, pulsing like a heartbeat. The departure terminal was built to evoke calm, but it felt more like a mausoleum dressed up to hide its purpose. The line of volunteers moved forward slowly, dressed in gray uniforms, heads bowed in resignation or quiet acceptance. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say when you decided to step into Oblivion. Doran Reeve stood at the far end of the room in his black guide's coat, eyes fixed on the first set of doors where the next group would enter. His posture was steady, professional, but inside the familiar storm of guilt began to stir again. Every face was a reminder. Young, old, men, women, each of them had a reason to be here. Some were fleeing the crushing poverty outside the terminal's walls, desperate to give their families the compensation package promised for their departure. Others simply wanted to escape the suffocating pressure of a world buckling under its own weight. Earth could no longer breathe, and the VDI was the pressure valve. Doran's job was to be their shepherd, their calm before the void. He was supposed to believe in this. He was supposed to believe he was giving them peace. But as the line moved closer, his faith cracked with each passing second. The overhead speaker crackled to life. Group 47B stepped forward. The next group shuffled ahead, 30 of them. Their feet barely made a sound against the polished metal floor. A boy no older than 12 walked near the front, gripping his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Doran's throat tightened, but he forced himself to remain impassive. No exceptions, no attachments. They made that clear when they trained him. The group stopped at the final gate, a massive set of doors etched with the words, "A new horizon awaits." The letters had been worn down over time, their message faded, meaningless. Doran forced himself to step forward, drawing a breath that felt like sandpaper in his lungs. "Welcome," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've made a brave choice. You've given the people you love a chance at something better." His eyes passed over each face as he continued. Some nodded. Most stared straight ahead, blank-eyed. "Beyond these doors, you'll be taken to the departure chamber. There's no pain. It's quiet." That was a lie, but a necessary one. The boy looked up at him then, blue eyes wide, tear-filled. "What's it like?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Doran's mouth went dry. His training told him to give the approved answer, like falling asleep under the stars. But for once, the lie felt too heavy to hold. Instead, he crouched, meeting the boy's gaze. "I don't know," he admitted. The truth startled the boy, but it also seemed to calm him. The mother pulled her son closer, whispering something in his ear. The boy nodded, wiping his face. Doran straightened as the departure doors slid open with a low hiss. The room beyond was bathed in soft blue light. The departure chamber, the final step. Rows of sleek white pods, shaped like coffins, lined the walls. The air felt wrong in there, thin, metallic. It clung to the skin like cold fingers. The volunteers began filing into the room, taking their assigned places. Some hesitated. A man in his 70s touched the edge of his pod with trembling fingers before climbing inside, as though testing the chill of deep water. A woman sobbed quietly as the lid of her pod began to close, her breath fogging the glass. Doran turned away from the sound. If he let himself feel it, any of it, he wouldn't survive another day in this job. The boy and his mother entered side by side, their hands still locked. Their pods were adjacent, close enough that they could see one another through the glass. Doran stepped toward the control console. His fingers hovered over the activation key. This was the moment. The hum of the room seemed to amplify, vibrating deep into his bones. The countdown began. 30 seconds until launch. The process was automatic from here. The pods would seal, the gravity field would stabilize, and the gateway would open. A pinpoint of darkness swirling into being like a cosmic maw. Once the pods passed the event horizon, they would be gone, lost to whatever lay beyond. 20 seconds. A low murmur rippled through the air, at first barely perceptible, like a distant whisper. Doran frowned, glancing over his shoulder. None of the volunteers moved. They couldn't. The pods had locked in place. The whisper grew louder, disjointed syllables bleeding together, forming an indistinct hum. For a moment, Doran thought it was just the machinery. But then he saw the man in the third row, the one who had touched his pod with such reverence. The man's eyes were wide, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream. His body convulsed violently against the restraints, veins bulging in his neck. Blood began to seep from his nose and ears, staining the white pod interior. Doran's heart pounded as the man's head jerked sideways, his eyes locking onto Doran with a horrifying clarity. "It's alive," the man rasped. His voice was raw, barely human. "It's waiting." The whisper in the air coalesced into something unmistakable, a low, guttural sound, like a deep breath being drawn inward. The hair on Doran's arms stood on end as the room seemed to contract, the walls shivering as if the air itself was compressing. 5 seconds. The man's body jerked one final time, his spine arching upward until something in his torso gave a wet, snapping sound. Then he went limp, his face pressed against the glass, a red smear trailing down as his body collapsed inward like a deflated balloon. Doran's hand shot out toward the console. "Abort!" he shouted, but the system didn't respond. The countdown was irreversible now. The room erupted in a flash of pale light as the pods launched, sucked into the blackness beyond the chamber's gate. Doran watched helplessly as the boy's terrified face disappeared into the void, his mother's pod beside him. Silence followed, vast and final. Doran sank to his knees, cold sweat soaking through his uniform. The hum of the terminal faded into an unbearable stillness. Something had gone horribly wrong. But deep in his bones, he already knew. It wasn't just wrong. It had seen them, and it was still watching. Doran woke in the dark, his breath caught in his throat like a hook. For a long moment, he couldn't tell if he was still dreaming. The void behind his eyelids throbbed with afterimages, tangled shapes, writhing masses of muscle and bone, and somewhere beneath them, the faces of the people he'd sent through. They watched him with hollow eyes. He sat up abruptly, heart hammering, sweat cold against his back. The barracks room was empty and quiet, its sharp, synthetic smell pressing in from all sides. The nightmares were getting worse. The day's events looped through his mind. The boy clutching his mother's hand, the man's final scream. Doran rubbed his temples and forced himself to breathe slowly. He reached for the water on the metal nightstand and took a long sip. It tasted stale, metallic. Nothing felt clean anymore. The reports after the incident were a mess of contradictions. Officially, the death in the departure chamber had been ruled a freak medical event, a hidden aneurysm, they said. But Doran had seen something else in that man's eyes. Not fear, not pain. Recognition. As though he'd glimpsed something terrible on the other side and had just enough time to understand it. Doran wasn't sure when he realized he wasn't alone. The soft creak of weight shifting on the bench behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly, expecting one of the night guards. Instead, he saw a woman sitting there, silhouetted against the dim strip of emergency lighting. She was thin, her posture rigid, fingers locked together as if holding something invisible. Her eyes caught the light, 2 points of eerie calm in the dark. "You're Doran Reeve," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it that unsettled him. He nodded cautiously. "Yeah, who are you?" "Samantha Caro." She leaned forward slightly, her face coming into view. Pale skin, sharp cheekbones. She looked young, late 20s maybe, but her eyes seemed much older. The kind of eyes that had watched things unravel too many times. Doran shifted to face her. "How did you get in here?" She ignored the question. "I saw what happened today." Doran's stomach sank. Civilians weren't supposed to have access to the departure terminal. "You shouldn't have been there." She smiled faintly. "Neither should they." He felt the sting in her words but said nothing. Samantha's hands clenched tighter. "They're lying to you about what's on the other side." Her voice was calm but carried a weight that made the hairs on Doran's arms stand on end. Doran exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "You're not the first person to say that." He remembered the whispers, the nightmares people had described before stepping into the pods. "You're grieving. I get it. We all are." Samantha stood abruptly, stepping closer. There was no grief in her eyes, only a brittle intensity. "I'm not grieving," her voice sharpened. "I'm warning you." Doran tried to maintain his composure. "Warning me about what?" She hesitated, as if struggling to put something vast and unspeakable into words. "I've seen it. I've been close enough to feel it." She reached for her collar, unbuttoning the top of her shirt. Doran caught a glimpse of dark veins running up her throat, spidering beneath her skin like roots strangling a tree. He stepped back instinctively. What happened to you?" Samantha lowered her shirt, her expression grim. "They told me I wasn't compatible with the program. A misfire. They ejected my pod halfway through." Her voice cracked. "But I didn't come back alone." Doran's mind reeled. "You were in the gate?" Samantha nodded slowly. "Long enough to know it's alive." She took a shaking breath. "It doesn't just swallow us. It keeps us. It takes everything we are and makes it part of itself." Doran felt the floor shift beneath him. The room seemed smaller, pressing inward. He thought of the man's body collapsing in the pod, his final words. "It's alive." "You don't understand," Samantha said, stepping closer. "It's not just some predator feeding on us. It needs us. We're pieces of it, like cells in a body. And once it has you, you don't stop existing. You change. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I can still hear it sometimes, whispering, calling me back. Doran's skin crawled. He wanted to dismiss her as paranoid, delusional. But the raw fear in her eyes was real, and so were the marks on her body. What does it want? He asked, his voice hoarse. Samantha closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears. More. Doran felt something cold settle in his chest. The program wasn't saving anyone. It was feeding something vast, ancient, and incomprehensible. And if Samantha was right, then every volunteer who'd crossed that threshold was still out there, absorbed, remade, screaming into a void where no one could hear them. The door to the barracks slid open with a soft hiss, startling them both. 2 guards in white uniforms stepped in, their expressions blank but watchful. Samantha took a step back. They'll kill me if they know I told you. Doran's pulse raced as the guards closed the distance. Is there a problem, Reeve? One of them asked. His tone was polite, but his hand rested lightly on his sidearm. Doran shook his head. No problem. The guard's eyes flicked to Samantha. You're not authorized to be here. Samantha met his gaze without flinching. I was just leaving. The guards moved to escort her, but she glanced over her shoulder at Doran, something desperate in her eyes. If you go back in there, you'll see it too. The door slid shut behind her, leaving Doran in silence. He sat back down on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty space where Samantha had been. Her words echoed in his mind. It's alive. It needs you. And it's calling you back. Doran pressed his hands against his face, trying to push the thoughts away. But deep down, he knew there was no going back. Something had changed. In the stillness of the room, the hum of the machinery seemed to shift again, forming a low, mournful whisper that made his skin crawl. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a voice, and it knew his name. Doran braced himself as the shuttle doors locked with a hiss behind him. The sterile hum of the pre-flight chamber pressed down on his ears, muffling everything except the pounding of his heart. The countdown sequence had already begun. He adjusted the control harness over his shoulders, his fingers trembling. Beyond the reinforced window, the gate shimmered, a swirling mass of darkness punctured by brief flashes of blue light, like veins pulsing beneath translucent skin. The core of the black hole was barely visible, a singularity wrapped in layers of fractured space. This wasn't a mission. It was suicide, and Doran knew it. But he also knew he couldn't keep living with the whispers in his mind. Samantha's voice, the man's final words, "It's alive," followed him into every breath, every waking moment. The truth was inside that void, and if no one else was going to confront it, he would. The shuttle jerked as the stabilization thrusters engaged. Doran winced as the console lit up, displaying a long line of encrypted warnings, biosignature mismatches, unauthorized launch parameters. None of it mattered. He'd overridden the system. A distorted voice crackled over the comms. Unauthorized shuttle. Abort launch immediately. Doran didn't respond. His hand hovered over the primary control. Beyond the comm static, he could hear another sound, deep and slow, like the breathing of something vast. It wasn't the machinery. The gate roared open and gravity tore at the edges of reality. The shuttle's walls groaned under the sudden pressure, metal warping slightly as space bent inward. The comms exploded with overlapping voices. "Reeve, this is a containment breach. Shut it down now." The shuttle surged forward into the heart of the event horizon, and the world outside dissolved. The light was the first thing to go. The windows were swallowed by a darkness so complete that it was like falling blind into an endless ocean. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural hum that vibrated through Doran's chest, louder than thought, louder than fear. The shuttle's stabilizers screamed as the gravitational forces pulled them in every direction. Doran's vision blurred, stars forming patterns behind his eyes. He clenched his jaw, fighting to stay conscious. The hum grew louder, and with it came something else, a shifting mass outside the window, forming and dissolving like ripples across oil. It wasn't empty. The void was alive. The shuttle shuddered violently as it crossed the final boundary, slipping fully into the black hole's grasp. Doran's body felt like it was being unmade, his bones bending, his skin crawling with the unbearable sensation of splitting apart at the seams. Then, everything stopped. The hum quieted. The shuttle floated in absolute stillness. Doran gasped for breath and forced himself upright. He looked out the front viewport and his stomach twisted into knots. He wasn't in the void anymore. The shuttle hovered in an expanse that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The walls of this space were composed of something organic, ivory-like structures protruding at uneven angles, almost resembling ribs. Between the bony spires pulsed translucent membranes laced with blood-red veins. The entire structure shimmered like living tissue. Doran unlatched his harness and staggered toward the glass. It wasn't a black hole. It was a body, a vast, incomprehensible organism stretched across the fabric of space itself. The shuttle's lights flickered as something moved beyond the membrane, a shadow sliding beneath the surface, slow and sinuous. It had no definite form, only a mass of shifting muscle and bone that seemed to break and reassemble itself as it moved. Doran felt the familiar chill creep down his spine. The whisper returned, brushing the edges of his mind like a cold breath. "Come closer." The voice wasn't Samantha's. It wasn't human, but it spoke directly to him, filling his thoughts until they weren't his own. Doran grabbed the emergency rifle from its storage compartment and stepped toward the airlock. He knew how insane it was, stepping out into this nightmare, but he also knew he wouldn't get answers sitting in the shuttle. He keyed in the sequence and the outer door slid open. The air was thick but breathable, though it carried a smell that made his stomach lurch, like iron, salt, and something spoiled. The floor beneath him was soft and fibrous, yielding slightly under his weight like old skin. He walked forward slowly, the organic walls pulsing faintly around him. Ahead, the corridor opened into a massive chamber. Doran stopped in his tracks, bile rising in his throat. The walls were lined with human shapes, hundreds of them fused into the membrane like insects caught in amber. Their features were distorted but recognizable, hands pressed outward, faces locked in expressions of terror. He saw the boy from the departure room, his small body embedded in the wall beside his mother, their forms half absorbed. Doran took a shuddering step back, but the whisper coiled tighter around his thoughts. They're not dead. They're becoming. The truth hit him like a blow to the chest. The black hole didn't destroy the volunteers, it consumed and repurposed them. The bodies weren't separate anymore. They were cells in the organism, part of its endless hunger. Doran raised the rifle, aiming toward the pulsating core of the chamber. His hand shook. He could feel it watching him, not with eyes, but with something deeper. The shadows along the walls began to shift, peeling away from the membrane like limbs unfolding. Bone-like appendages stretched outward, connected by sinew. A mass of ribbed muscle unfurled in the center of the chamber, forming a grotesque, half-humanoid shape. It stood nearly 3 stories tall, its form constantly shifting as if trying to choose which bones belonged where. Human faces twisted and merged across its surface, their mouths open in a silent, collective scream. Doran's breath caught in his throat as the creature took a step forward, the floor trembling beneath its weight. It spoke without words. Its voice was in his marrow, his blood. "You are already mine." Doran fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder as the rifle spat plasma into the creature's torso. The impact burned through its outer layers, and for a moment, the chamber filled with the acrid smell of scorched tissue. But the wound sealed almost immediately, the muscle knitting itself back together in a wet, grotesque motion. The creature lunged forward. Doran barely dove aside in time as a bone-tipped appendage smashed into the floor where he'd stood. The impact cracked the fibrous ground, sending tremors through the chamber. Scrambling to his feet, Doran pulled a small detonator from his belt. His emergency plan had always been a last resort, and now there was no choice. He armed the charge, a small antimatter core designed to obliterate everything within a mile radius. It wouldn't kill the black hole itself, but maybe it could sever part of the creature's body, enough to stop its spread. The creature surged toward him again, its mouthless face twisting into something that resembled rage. Doran sprinted toward the far side of the chamber, his legs screaming in protest. He reached the far wall and slammed the detonator against the membrane. It latched on with a mechanical hiss. The creature let out a deafening screech, a sound that was both rage and pain. Doran activated the timer. 15 seconds. The walls began to convulse, veins bursting in sprays of dark fluid. The chamber shook as the membrane twisted violently. Doran turned and ran, but he knew he wouldn't make it to the shuttle in time. The creature's limbs crashed down around him, sealing off the exit. The timer hit 0. For a brief second there was silence. Then the chamber erupted in blinding white light. Doran felt himself lifted, weightless, as the explosion tore through the organic walls. The last thing he saw was the creature unraveling, its bones splitting apart like shattered glass. Then there was nothing, only the whisper fading, and finally, silence. There was no pain. Doran drifted through a void without direction, a weightless fragment of thought. He had no sense of body or self, only the fading echo of the explosion and the distant, hollow memory of breath. His awareness unraveled like threads caught in a slow current, pulled outward toward nothingness. But the silence didn't last. A low, resonant hum stirred the edges of his mind, a familiar rhythm, slow and steady, like a heartbeat from across a great chasm. His senses reassembled in jagged pieces, the sharp taste of metal in his mouth, the cold press of something against his back, and the faint pull of gravity beneath him. He gasped and opened his eyes. The world around him was dying. Doran lay on a jagged slope of what remained of the organic structure. The chamber was torn apart, splintered bone-like columns jutted upward, some still smoldering from the antimatter detonation. Ribbons of torn membrane fluttered weakly, spilling thick streams of dark fluid that pooled in viscous lakes. The creature was gone, but its remains pulsed faintly, twitching with some instinctive dying motion. Doran sat up, every muscle screaming in protest. His vision swam, and he felt the unmistakable wetness of blood trickling from his scalp. He didn't have much time. The explosion had torn through the organism's core, but it hadn't ended everything. Beyond the ruined walls, the horizon was fracturing. Space itself shimmered unnaturally. Fissures of light opened and closed like wounds in the fabric of the void. The black hole was destabilizing. For the first time in hours, or maybe days, Doran felt a flicker of hope. It's collapsing. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs. The remains of his shuttle lay crushed beneath debris at the far end of the chamber, half buried in organic matter. The cockpit had been reduced to molten scrap, but part of the emergency beacon remained intact, a battered, blinking light pulsing weakly in the darkness. Doran staggered toward it, coughing as the air thickened with smoke and something sickly sweet. He reached the beacon and dropped to his knees, fingers fumbling over the controls. The screen was cracked, its readout barely legible, but it didn't matter. He only needed one function: a rescue signal. Doran set the beacon's frequency to its highest range and pressed the activation key. The device emitted a high-pitched ping, signaling its broadcast. For a moment, nothing happened. The beacon's faint glow flickered, threatening to go out. Then, the signal stabilized. The blinking pulse filled the dark like a heartbeat. Doran slumped back, exhaustion finally taking hold. He knew the odds of anyone finding him were microscopic. No one had ever returned from a black hole. But even if the signal went unanswered, it was a sign that something still existed outside this nightmare. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of stillness. The air grew colder, and the hum of collapsing space filled the background like the steady groan of shifting tectonic plates. The void was folding in on itself, its dying breaths felt in the tremors beneath his feet. Then, the whisper returned. Soft at first, almost gentle. Doran. His eyes snapped open. The chamber flickered around him, and his pulse surged with dread. He forced himself to his feet again, his breathing shallow. "No," he whispered. But it was there. The hum he had thought destroyed was building again, vibrating through the bones of the dying structure. Something moved at the edge of his vision, faint like a ripple in water. He turned sharply, staring into the shadows where the walls dissolved into darkness. A form emerged, disjointed and shuddering, its mass barely holding shape. It was smaller now, weakened by the explosion, but it was still alive. Its ribbed torso twisted, limbs clawing for balance as though relearning how to stand. The faces that had been fused to its surface were gone. Only a smooth, pale expanse remained where they had once writhed. Doran's breath caught. "You should be dead." The creature's body pulsed, and its head-like protrusion tilted toward him. It had no mouth, but its voice filled the air like a low, mournful chorus. "So should you." Doran's stomach twisted. He reached instinctively for the emergency knife strapped to his belt, though he knew it was useless. The creature moved slowly, as though in pain, but its presence still filled the chamber with a suffocating weight. "Why?" it asked, the question reverberating through his skull. "Why resist? You are already part of me." The whisper scraped against his mind like nails against bone, stirring old memories. Samantha's face, the boy's hand clutched in his mother's. The lives that had been taken, reshaped, and lost. Doran's fear melted into something else. Anger. "No," he growled, taking a step forward. His grip tightened on the knife. "I'm not yours, and I never was." The creature's form rippled, its limbs unfurling in jagged lines. The hum deepened, a resonant growl that shook the chamber. Doran raised the knife, his voice trembling but defiant. "You took them. You used them. But not anymore." He lunged forward, driving the blade into the exposed mass of tissue at the center of the creature's chest. The blade sank deep, and a burst of dark fluid spilled out, hissing as it hit the floor. The creature let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like a release of pressure, a long exhalation of something ancient and weary. Its form convulsed violently, collapsing inward. The walls of the chamber shuddered, and the fissures in the void widened. Doran stumbled back as the ground split beneath him. The void roared with collapsing energy, its final death knell echoing through his bones. He closed his eyes as the light grew brighter, swallowing everything. And then, silence. When Doran opened his eyes again, he was floating in an endless expanse of stars. His body felt weightless, but whole. The pain was gone, replaced by a strange warmth. He turned slowly, disoriented, trying to understand where he was. A familiar sound reached his ears, the soft hum of a ship's engine. He looked up and saw the outline of a rescue vessel above him, its lights flickering like distant beacons. A shadowed figure leaned into view through the cockpit window, a human silhouette. Doran's heart surged with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The light around him intensified, and for a moment he thought he saw her, Samantha. Or maybe someone else entirely. A pale hand reached out toward him through the brilliance. He reached back, his fingers brushing the edge of the light. The stars bent around them and the void closed behind him. There was no whisper, no hunger, just silence, and the end of all things.